Okay, I think we'll begin. This webinar is originating from the City of Vancouver, which is founded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Some speakers will also be presenting from other locations, and we will respectfully acknowledge those traditional territories. Hello, my name is Sophie King. I am the Manager of Professional Learning, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to PIBC's second PLN webinar, Servicing and Infrastructure. Today we are pleased to welcome Guy Patterson, partner with the law firm of Young Anderson, Paul Rosen, Director of Engineering, and Carmi Simpson, Engineering Services Senior Technologist, both with the City of Nanaimo. We also have Cam So, Director of Public Works and Utilities with the District of Lillooet, and Nick Mead-Fox, Senior Engineer with the City of Vancouver. Welcome to all of our presenters. Thank you for your time in sharing your thoughts here today with all of us. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to both the recording and the slide presentation will be sent to you, all of you who have registered, shortly after the webinar airs. And a word about the Q&A today. Usually we invite everyone to submit their questions, but because we're doing things a little differently today, we had invited everyone to submit 2 questions upon registration. And our presenters will be working on answering those questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can. So the Q&A today will focus on these previously submitted questions. Okay, so I think we'll begin the presentation now. I would like to invite Guy to turn on his webcam. Hi, Guy. Welcome.
Hi there.
Hello. I will turn my camera off, and you're welcome to begin.
Okay, thanks, Sophie. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks for having me, PIBC. So I did get a chance to look at some, well, I guess most of the questions that were submitted in advance, and I'll hopefully try in my 15 to 20 minutes that I have to address hopefully the gist of at least some of the questions that I think were most related to anyway the area that I'm qualified to speak about, which is more obviously on the legal side of the servicing and infrastructure implications of some of this new housing legislation, not on the what I would say maybe the technical engineering side. Obviously, we have others more qualified to deal with those aspects. Anyway, so yeah, I'll try to focus on what in my practice, in my thinking to date on all this new legislation, what are the challenges, implications, and legal issues arising from the servicing and infrastructure implications of what really amounts to, I think I'm just starting to describe it as a fire hose of new provincial legislation. And now we have, at least I think as far as it's gotten to first reading, I'm not sure if it's gotten beyond first reading, we now have Bill 16 to add to the mix. We've been talking about Bills 44, 46, and 47 for a few months now. And now we've got even more content to grapple with. And a lot of the material in Bill 16, which I have tried to look at in the time leading up to this talk, is definitely relevant to some of the questions that we've been asked to address in the general topic of servicing and infrastructure, and some of the questions already were related to Bill 16 specifically. So I will try to make some comments about that. Again, acknowledging that it's fresh, hot off the press, and I think only at first reading. But if the previous legislation is anything to learn from, it will. Bill 16 will also be zipping through the legislature and ending up getting adopted or given royal assent in short order. So my like big picture view of at least bills 44 and 47 is that these but what the province has done, I mean, the province had various options as far as how to deal with the housing crisis that it identified. And the housing, I wouldn't want to be remiss not to mention, of course, the housing, I think it was called the Housing Supply Act, was the first foray. And that's the act that allows for the creation of what is being, I think, called the naughty list, and allows the provinces basically set housing targets for specific municipalities, and kind of force municipalities to work on and report on and make progress on the delivery of those new housing units. Anyway, that wasn't enough, obviously. And so then, was shortly followed by the fall legislation. And again, the real, I think, at least for the purpose of what I want to share with you today, the real crux of the new housing supply legislation is the loss of what I'm calling the zoning discretion. And that's achieved, and again, this is familiar territory, but I just want to quickly review it. That's achieved in Bill 44 by the creation of these restricted zones in Section 481.3 of the Act. And in the restricted zones, now, people are familiar, you're obliged to authorize at least 2 housing units for almost all existing or pre-existing detached dwelling zones, 4 units, housing units in urban containment boundaries and communities over 5,000, 6 units if close to transit. And I think important to point out, there is an exemption to the 4 and 6 unit obligations for land that is not connected to a water or sewer system provided as a service by a municipality or a regional district. So already built into the obligations to allow more housing units is an exemption for land not connected to a water or sewer system. And then we have also, of course, Bill 47, the transit-oriented area designation, the obligation to designate transit-oriented areas, and in those areas, a prohibition on exercising zoning powers in a manner that would prohibit the prescribed minimum heights and densities that have to be authorized. So in different ways, both of these pieces of legislation, in my pitch, in my argument, amount to the same thing, which is a loss of the zoning discretion. And when I say that, I mean, a loss of what was always seen as the local government's ability to create whatever zoning regime it wants, allow whatever uses and densities it prefers, and then, wait for the applications to come in for additional density, additional residential density, additional housing units, and then always retain the discretion to say no, and then use the exercise of that discretion to say no as a way to ensure any new housing units would be accompanied by whatever necessary works and services, other amenities, infrastructure upgrades the local government considered necessary to support the density being requested, right? So I think for decades, the practice evolved of using the zoning discretion as a way to kind of do everything else that the municipality, that the local government wanted to do. So that zoning moment became so critical to the local government's not only planning and land use management regime, but also works and services, servicing and infrastructure, community parks, highway. It was sort of like everything got wrapped up in the laundry list of requirements that were lumped in at the zoning stage. And now all of a sudden the province has come along and stripped away that zoning discretion, at least for the minimum required densities and heights in the case of transit-oriented areas. So local governments, who again have become so accustomed to doing all their hard work at the zoning stage, are sort of scrambling to figure out how to do all that important work without having the zoning discretion available to them, at least in respect of the minimum Bill 44 and 47 densities. So that context, that new context, the province has created for planning and land use management decisions in local government, for local governments in BC, raises what I think is really the question that kind of underlies many of the questions that I read in the in the list, which I kind of try to boil down to the question of whether the loss of the zoning discretion that I've tried to describe translates into or necessarily equals a loss of authority to ensure adequate infrastructure and servicing for these new housing units that are now allowed as a matter of zoning. So I want to emphasize, I underlined in the previous slide, there's the word zoning. My pitch, I keep using that word, my theory here, or what I want to emphasize is that it's only one feature of the local government's broad range of legislative and regulatory powers. It's only one small piece of that bigger puzzle that has been stripped away. The only thing that these bills are forcing local governments to do is change zoning. No other legislative discretion or authority has been similarly stripped away. So what is left after these new housing unit density obligations is what we want to examine, right? We don't have now that discretion we traditionally relied on. What do we have? What remains? What opportunities exist for local governments to still meet, fulfill, ensure all those other important local government functions, and in particular, the important function of ensuring adequate works and services, adequate infrastructure for whatever density and development is being foisted upon them. So what I want to do is look at what I say are the remaining, I guess, pre-existing and now actually somewhat enhanced powers outside of the zoning power that local governments, in my sort of version of this, still have, can still rely on. Until Bill 16 came along, I was almost going to say none of this has changed. Now, in fact, not only has it not changed, but actually these powers have been somewhat enhanced by what's proposed in Bill 16. Bill 46 already gave a little bit more authority for development cost charges. Now Bill 16 is proposing changes to the works and servicing, the subdivision servicing bylaw power, mostly under Section 506 and also under 513. There's always been the authority under the Community Charter, or similarly for regional districts in the Local Government Act, to regulate in relation to services that municipalities provide and to impose fees in respect of those services. The BC Building Code is still there, which says potable water and public sewer are required for most, if not all, buildings that are subject to the building code. The other piece, sorry, that I wanted to write down was, of course, and this is it's almost like taboo to say this, but let's not forget, municipalities can always use general revenue that they generate through property taxes to build necessary infrastructure for their communities. So, that's almost like taboo to suggest that we might just raise taxes to pay for works and services and other infrastructure, but that still remains an option. Even outside of the nerve-wracking proposition of using general revenue. Again, there's these other very well established, fairly elaborate, detailed regulatory tools that exist, and I say still exist, have always existed, and now have been enhanced, that are specifically designed to deal with the inevitable questions about infrastructure and servicing to support density that is permitted by zoning. So another way I guess I've been describing is sort of the zoning moment is not the only moment. The zoning authority, the zoning discretion is not the only opportunity. So I just try not to kind of philosophize too much more about that. I'll try to give you just a few more details about what I say these other critical legal tools are for meeting important community servicing and infrastructure objectives. So subdivision servicing bylaws, that's the defined term for the purpose of the Local Government Act. Basically means a bylaw under Section 506. In that section, the bylaw can require and set standards for water, sewer, drainage, and highways in connection with the subdivision of land. And now that's been changed to refer not just to subdivision, but actually more generally to what's called the development of land. So again, it goes beyond subdivision. It's not just at the subdivision stage that your Section 506 authority can be exercised. It's also at the building permit, or what's called the development stage, right? So the bylaw can set the standards, can regulate and prescribe, as always, highways, sidewalks, boulevards, and now what's being added, and previously it was basically highways, water, sewer, and drainage. Now what's being added is amenities, including benches, bollards, bike parking facilities, signage, parklets, street lamps. So I wonder if this is the only piece of legislation in BC that uses the word parklet. Anyway, street lamps, street signs, transit shelters, or waste disposal and recycling containers. And again, this is all in Bill 16 as proposed to be the new and improved Section 506. And again, the authority here is to set standards, make bylaws that can be applied to any subdivision or development, and impose those standards at the subdivision or building permit stage. Again, so the expansion includes transportation infrastructure that supports walking, biking, public transit, or other alternative forms of transportation. And I can't resist mentioning my crusade to stop using the word alternative and start using the word preferred. But anyway, we all know what the legislature is talking about here, anything other than single occupant vehicles. Sustainable design features that provide for energy and water conservation, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and climate resilience. So that's new. And any other class of things that may be prescribed by regulation, right? So this is the new and improved Section 506 subdivision servicing bylaw authority. And then in sections 507 and 8, which still exist, you can go not just to require these things in connection with the site or subdivision being developed and the immediately adjacent highways. You can go beyond that into making excess and extended works and services requirements if you want. Okay, so that's Section 506 and related sections. Then there's development cost charges, which people know about. You know, maybe nothing new, but again, it's still there. Don't forget about it. You can charge money for every subdivision and building permit application, not everyone, but most or many, to help raise funds for the capital costs of new infrastructure and parks. And Bill 46 did again make a little bit of slightly expand the development cost charge authority. As I mentioned, I won't spend too much time on this, but again, there is this underlying authority to regulate in relation to services and impose fees and charges in relation to services that the local government provides. And then again, finally, the building code doesn't allow for the issuance of building permits without water and sewer. So one more little point I did want to say, I'm sorry, I'm as always going over time, but there is also the new Section 513 that's proposed in Bill 16, where now an approving officer has extra authority to require the dedication of land for sustainable design features, transportation infrastructure that supports walking, biking, public transit, and other alternative preferred forms of transport up to 5 meters wind width. And then you can appoint a servicing officer to do basically the same thing at the building permit stage. Again, additional, this is the big one that everyone's been asking for, these additional road dedication powers. So again, that seems like it's going to be available for local governments to acquire additional dedications for sustainable design features and transportation infrastructure in connection with subdivisions or developments. Finally, there's a new authority to create, or might be a new authority to create a separate bylaw to advance transportation demand management in respect to the development of land. So again, that would be likely at the building, and you can impose requirements on owners to provide one or more transportation demand management features that might include electric vehicle charging stations, end of trip facilities, secure bike parking, and other kind of similar related matters. So, ask and you shall receive. The legislature is giving you new authority to impose requirements at the subdivision and building permit stage to get more new different kinds of works and services, including road designations, in addition to the underlying authority for water, sewer, drainage infrastructure at the subdivision and building permit stage. Again, all that comes after zoning. So my last slide, I say building permits can be refused for non-compliance with all relevant bylaws and regulations, not just zoning. So zoning isn't the only relevant consideration. The removal of the zoning discretion might not be the end of the world. The sky is not falling as a result of the loss of the zoning discretion. It just places a sharper focus and probably requires you to pay closer attention to the exercise of the other kinds of authorities that exist. So I won't touch on the very last question, but other than to say, I think probably the answer is no, that if zoning is available but works and services are insufficient, I don't think a local government is obliged to rectify the deficiency. The local government can basically force the developer to rectify the deficiency, or in the event that the deficiency can't be rectified, then refuse the issuance of the building permit, even though the zoning would in theory support it. So sorry for going a few minutes longer than I was supposed to. Thanks everyone for your attention, and I will stay tuned for the rest and be available for questions if that's happening later.
Thank you, Guy. Thank you for the tips and all the information there. Our next speaker will be, the city of Nanaimo. We have Paul Rosen and Carmi Simpson from the city of Nanaimo. And I already asked Paul if they were going to hand out some Nanaimo bar samples, but apparently not. Welcome, you two.
Thanks, Sophie. It's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, unfortunately with webinars, we can't hand out free samples of Nanaimo bars, but we thought we'd throw a picture up there and give folks the recipe if there was an interest in trying them out. Before we get started, I just want to point out that Carmi and I are not experts at Bill 44 or urban planning. We're just a couple of technical folks, and we're really fortunate to be able to answer or evaluate some of the infrastructure impact questions related to that fairly quickly. So we just thought it'd be worthwhile kind of sharing our experience with sort of the process we went through for that. So here's a quick map of the area. So Nanaimo has a population of about 100,000 now, a little bit over that. It's sort of a fairly long and drawn out geography. It's about 20 kilometers long, about 3 to 5 kilometers wide, depending on the area. And our growth rate in Nanaimo is quite high. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the country for the past couple of years. Our growth rate, I think it's just under 2%. So we're putting in about, I believe it's a little over 1,000 new housing units every year. So we have about, I think it's around 22,000 single detached homes in town. And that accounts for about 50% of our housing stock. So here's a map of our zoning in town here, just a portion of the city, and the yellow is the residential, which, like I mentioned, is about 50% single family dwelling. So you can see we have quite a bit of residential. We do have some. We have an offshore island called Protection Island. It's fully serviced for water and sewer, and so we have a few sort of oddball locations like that. Just in terms of a bit of a background, the city provides water, sewer, and stormwater services to the vast majority of the city. To support those services, we have a citywide sewer model. That model is calibrated with actual flow information, and its level of detail is down to the parcel level, which is a little bit unusual, but helps us quite a bit. And then the same thing goes for the water model. We also have as and when contracts with engineering consultants to help run the models and do the analyses for us. So we can go to the right folks and ask the questions and get answers fairly quickly. So in 2023, we did a fairly major OCP update. And as part of that, we did a lot of demographics evaluations and forecasting, and got a good understanding of the infrastructure impacts with that. So we were sort of well set up to understand the sort of the impacts of growth going forward over the sort of the planning horizon. And then we're also in the process of updating our DCC project lists. And so that work was fairly mature by the time Bill 44 hit in the fall. So we were sort of well positioned to be able to answer these types of questions. So our water system has a little over 700 kilometers of supporting pipe and infrastructure and so on. It's worth about $1.5 billion, and it's built over many, many decades. And it's designed to meet the engineering standards, and it typically has an asset life of the pipes themselves have asset lives over 75 years in many cases. So these are really long-term assets, and it's not easy to go and replace them or upsize them or what have you. So obviously we provide water for domestic needs, commercial, industrial process, and so on. But one of the key design criteria for the water system is actually the amount of fire suppression water that we provide. So for single-family dwelling areas, our engineering standards dictate a minimum of 75 liters per second. And obviously other zoning, like commercial and industrial, they have higher flow rate requirements, like 200 or 300 liters per second. And a lot of that is dictated by, or it's tied back to the requirements under the Fire Underwriters Survey. Now, they're a national organization that provides data and standards for the insurance industry. They periodically evaluate the effectiveness of fire protection services and provide a score that then impacts the insurance rates within that area. So the score that we get in Nanaimo with the Fire Underwriters Survey dictates how much people pay for their house insurance. So it's a fairly important thing that we adhere to their standards. So the thing is, developers, they have a lot of control over how much fire flow water that they need on their development. So they can control things like their square footage, their choice of materials for their building, the setbacks, whether they sprinkle or not, so on and so forth. So the developers actually have quite a lot of control to determine what their fire flow requirements are for their development. Now let's move on to the sanitary sewer system here. So we have about 600 kilometers of sewer pipes. We provide the collection. We don't provide the treatment. That's done by the regional district. But an important point here is the minimum pipe size we have in our engineering standards is actually quite big. It's actually, so 200 millimeter diameter pipe, it's 8-inch diameter. It actually has a lot of capacity, and we do that more for operational reasons to be able to complete the flushing, the inspection with the cameras, and so on and so forth. But what that means is in the upper ends of a catchment, where they're like the sort of the leaves on a tree, for instance, there's actually a lot of surplus capacity in the network at those points. We also have, like I mentioned previously, we have these sort of pocket areas. So we have some areas where we have low pressure sewers, and we have this protection island, which is sort of serviced in a special way. It's not just conventional gravity sewer. And then with storm sewer, I put storm sewer up there. I mean, we didn't spend a lot of time considering it because in our engineering standards, as part of developments, they are required to match the pre-development hydrograph with their development. So in theory, new developments are not going to contribute in any significant way increases to the storm sewers like loading. So really that sort of came off the table fairly early on in our evaluation. So Bill 44. So when Bill 44 hit, we already had substantial growth already planned for. The difference was now that the location of the growth was potentially now a lot less focused on urban nodes. Our OCP had envisioned that we would focus our growth ideally around these city centers or these urban nodes, recognizing that we weren't going to get all of it in there, but I think that was the hope. But now with Bill 44, potentially could be quite decentralized. So for water, we ended up taking a little bit of a theoretical assessment of the fire flow requirements for a typical fourplex on a single family lot. And I think Carmi will get into that in a little bit, but just around the consequences of not meeting the FUS standard. Eventually, if we were to allow a bunch of developments to occur that had FUS fire flow requirements that are higher than what we were able to provide through the fire hydrants and through the water system, eventually we would get a poor score and our insurance rates in town would go up. So really that was a consequence that we were trying to avoid. So Carmi, I'd like to hand it over to you. I think Carmi's going to talk a little bit about the the findings and the technical analysis, and then I'll come back at the end and we can talk about the summary.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Paul. You covered most of it. I could just probably go home now. But for the water distribution, like Paul was saying, the really key part is the fire flow needed to support the fourplexes that are being proposed that to be able to be built on these single family dwellings. So we did a generic calculation of what a wood construction or kind of a worst case fourplex would be, and it would be somewhere around 150 liters a second. And it would only take one fourplex within an area of a fire hydrant to have an impact. So we calculated out the different areas within the city that had which fire hydrants weren't able to provide the 150 liters a second, and then identified those as high risk parcels. And then, so that really ended up only about 30% of our parcels. We've got a fairly robust water network within the city. So we really only have about 30% of the eligible parcels for single family development that would be considered at risk. So that didn't just stop the buck there. We said, well, because there are things like Paul had suggested, you can change your design, or you could actually do whatever the upgrades are needed downstream or upstream to support improved fire flow in that area where that fourplex is being built. So our approach was going to be that if somebody came forward with a development application for a fourplex, they needed to provide an FUS calculation, find out what is the required one. If there is, because there's lots of areas that aren't a problem, and then if there is available fire flow just under the 150, and that this meets that criteria, then they don't have to do anything. If they need more, then they either can do the upgrades or redesign the project to lower the FUS to whatever is available. Sanitary, and then this shows just the scattering. These are the at-risk parcels within the city. So as you can see, we've got lots. So it's only about a third of our parcels that are at risk, and will need some extra work or attention. For the sanitary sewer, it's a bit different because the sanitary sewer is a network that's cumulative. So stuff that flows from upstream flows downstream, and then the flows get bigger and bigger as they go down. And this is where I think Bill 44 threw us in a loop, because we had spent a lot of time looking at where the planners had thought the growth should occur in these high density nodes, and then looked at what happened to the network. This one was we had no idea where the growth was going to happen. So we just said, well, let's have a look at what would happen if every single lot had a fourplex on it, and then see what it looks like. And if it blows up, then we'll have to go back. So we called that the extreme scenario. And then we kind of split out what we had already, because we had a lot of growth already baked into our OCP update. So we just wanted to see what that incremental difference that Bill 44 would make. So in that, we, at the end of the day, out of our 600 kilometers of sanitary mains, only about 12 kilometers were identified as deficient. And out of that, 90% of those are actually in scheduled projects that we've already identified through other means that need to be done. So there's maybe 10% of these deficient pipes that need upgrading, and they're scattered throughout the city. So we kind of said, well, we update both our citywide sanitary model and our water model as well. they're on a 2-year cycle. So, and I mean, the likelihood of all of this stuff blowing up and getting built all at once is not going to happen. So I think we've got time to just monitor it, see where the trends are going, see if there is an area where there's a lot more activity, then we can create projects to address any pinch points downstream. So for our sanitary incremental, these pink dots, those are really the only additional deficiencies that this Bill 44, it seems to, that's the impact that we kind of figured out at this point in time. So we're not really in and out. We're going to keep an eye on it, but I don't think it's a catastrophe at this point in time, especially because we've artificially loaded the system. I don't think this is all going to happen all at once for a very long time. And Paul, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okie doke. Thanks, Carmi, for that. So just in summary, for water, we've identified properties that are having less than 150 liters per second available fire flow. And if a developer comes along and wants to put a fourplex on those, we'll require them to do an FUS calculation, which is a standard calculation for an engineering firm. And then they have to basically either manage within that with their development, or they would have to find a way to upgrade it and so on. Especially if it's not a city priority, they would have to do that themselves. So that's our game plan for that. We have no plans to change the engineering standard fire flow of 75 liters a second for those areas that were historically single-family dwelling, just because the lifespan of those assets, it would be an enormous amount of money to go in there and try and upgrade those things. So definitely not planning to do that. For sewer, we were very relieved and surprised that actually there was very little impact from this decentralization of growth with Bill 44, so with that worst case scenario, that extreme level scenario that Carmi talked about. So we were really quite relieved with that, but we are going to monitor things going forward, as Carmi mentioned. And then with storm, we really don't have any concerns, as I mentioned, because of that engineering standard requiring hydrograph matching. So I think that's it for our slide deck. So Sophie, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Carmi. So now we've just heard from a medium-sized, fast-growing community. So we're going to change gears here and go to a smaller community, I believe, with a population under 5,000 people. And I would like to welcome Cam So, Director of Public Works and Utilities with the District of Lillooet. Cam, are you able to join us? I know you had some issues earlier.
Oh,
we can hear you.
My camera's turning on now. Oh, there I am.
Okay, it might take a moment.
Camera turn on.
There.
Oh,
okay. You're good to go.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Cam So. I'm the current Director of Public Works and Utilities for the District of Lillooet. I've been in my job for 6 months, and it was interesting to hear what the city of Nanaimo was doing with their infrastructure servicing requirements, because I would say that we're the exact same, except for a smaller scale, and we're completely different in every way. The picture that you're seeing on the screen is looking south of the town, which we're surrounded by mountains, and through the center of town is the Fraser River. That blue streak in the center of the picture is the remnants of Seton River, which is where the town gets its drinking water from. And in this presentation, I'll be talking about the service requirements, especially concerning water for new dwellings in a small town. As I said, we're the exact same. Lillooet's the exact same as Nanaimo, only that instead of 200,000 people, we have 2,000 people with a population that has been shrinking over the past 20 years. The employment in town was typically forestry and mining, which the forestry has slowly been winding down over the last 20 years. And now the employment is particularly tourism in the summer months. Unemployment is 3% higher than the provincial average, and the median housing prices is about $500,000, which has risen 4 times as much over the last 10 years and is significantly lower than other communities surrounding Lillooet. So if you don't know where Lillooet is, it's that red dot on the map, and it is about 2-hour drive east of Kamloops and 2 hours south of drive 2 hours south to Whistler. The type of houses in Lillooet are typically single-family dwellings, with not much diversity. The water demands for the district is average daily demand of 3.32 megaliters a day, with a maximum daily demand of 7.52 megaliters a day, which could be found in around July, August. With our water model, we predict with a 1% growth, if that ever occurs. I said the population was shrinking, but our average daily demand would come to 4 megaliters a day, and our maximum daily demand would be 9 megaliters a day. Our water treatment plant can currently produce 6 megaliters a day, which, if we had sustainable growth, we would need to increase our water resource supply. One thing I forgot to add to the slide was the average use of water per person is 870 liters a day. The provincial average is 312 liters a day per person. So on average, we are using 3 times as much water per person a day. This is a picture of our very controversial yet very new water treatment plant. It is at the base of the Seton River and a Cayush campground, where it's where we get primarily most of our drinking water, 93.8%. We have a number of wells around town that can supplement the production of water, most noticeably at the recreational center, which in the month of July and August, we can draw 6.2% of our water usage. The limiting factor of water production is our pale infrastructure system, or filtration system, that produces the 6 megaliters of water a day that we need. The combined storage of our entire town is from these 3 reservoirs. The top one is known as Town Creek. The one on the bottom left is known as the Million Gallon, which holds 1 million gallons. And Dickey Creek, which is the underground of the bottom right reservoir, can hold a combined total of 7.5 megaliters a day. Or if the power goes out, we have 1 day use of water, which we can store, or about 18 hours. Our distribution network is, unlike Nanaimo, where they have hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, we have 32 kilometers of pipes, which were all built in the 60s. It is a combination of asbestos pipes, cast iron, steel, ductile iron, and parts unknown, which is probably asbestos or ductile iron. And we slowly replace 1 or 2 lines every 5 years with new PVC pipes. So needless to say, a lot of our water usage wastage, or the reasons why we're using so much water, is because of our distribution system. So unlike Vancouver or Nanaimo, our capital budget is a little different in scale, in that this year we have a capital budget in total of $200,000. Which is for the water treatment plant, the distribution network, and all our pump stations, which is not much. Our asset financial management plan that we put together recommends that to replace like for continued life cycle costs, that we should be spending $675,000 a year. With that being said, if we had a budget of $675,000 a year at our current capacity, we'd have a difficult time to provide those projects. We have a few internal problems at the moment, which I don't really want to get into in this presentation. But even delivering a $200,000 capital plan with our current capacity would be proven difficult. So as the first presentation with Guy Patterson, we sort of talked about the service requirements for new subdivisions, and we have my basic responsibility is that we have a subdivision and development servicing bylaw that all new developments have to follow if they want to get a building permit. So as the director of engineering, it's not my job to, or it's not my purview to deviate from the servicing division, servicing bylaw. We enforce it. And in the servicing bylaw, the Public Works Department reviews all proposals with respect to resurfacing, including roads, water, sanitary, and sewage, and it has to meet the minimum service requirements within the bylaw. And specifically with water, because that's the limiting factor in most of our development, the water that's connected to the new service division has to have proper flow and proper fire flow, as mentioned in the City of Nanaimo's presentation. And the number of certain hydrants that are required for new developments. And if the developer or subdivider wants to create the building permits and they aren't able to get those service requirements, they're responsible for bearing the upgrade of the system, or the cost of the upgrading the system to provide services for their particular project. So to give you some examples of some subdivision building permit requests that came through my office, was that there was a property in Lillooet that they wanted to subdivide into 3 separate properties. And when they separated those 3, the finished project, the property wouldn't meet the fire flow requirements of the FUS requirements. And to meet the requirements, they would need to upgrade their water line from their property to the lift station, or to the PRV, the pressure reducing valve, which is about 144 meters away. So at 500 meters, $500 per linear meter of water line, we estimated that would be $80,000 for the upgrade of the system if they wanted proper fire flow. So with that, the developer can decide if they wanted to provide the $80,000 to upgrade the house to subdivide their property, in which they said no. The other example that I wanted to bring up was that there was a request for the development of a 17 lot subdivision on the other side of the Fraser River. So the Fraser River sort of cuts the town in half. On the left-hand side, we provide services, and on the right-hand side, where Highway 12 is, we do not provide services. The water line does not go across the Fraser River as of yet. So there are some houses on the left-hand side of the Fraser River, but they're serviced by wells. And the number of wells that they have, they're deep, very deep. And in some places, the arsenic level is too high for drinking consumption. So development on the right-hand side of the river has been limited. So there is a requirement to have servicing if they want to build houses, but they can get a variance, or it's because it's not available within the bylaw, they're allowed to provide or find other sources of water. But for where they want to build their subdivisions, the wells would be cost prohibitive in itself to service those 17 houses. So the cost, one of the thoughts with the developer was that they wanted to deliver water from the water treatment plant, build the water line, attach it to the bridge across the Fraser River, across 3 kilometers of Modi right of way to service their properties. With that being said, the distribution network would cost about 7 to 10 million, and our water treatment plant can't produce enough water to service additional houses too. So they would have to provide the upgrades to the water treatment plant if they wanted to collect enough water. So with that being said, the municipal objectives of the District of Lillooet, one of them is to support sustainable housing But with our current servicing, it is difficult to allow new development of houses based on our subdivision. We just have too many issues that we can't deliver the services that are needed for the new development. So as a result, there have been too many new houses built in the last 20 years. I talked to the building inspector and asked him how many building permits we had for new houses, and we get on average 10 a year. With that being said, I don't see too many houses, so I don't know if those building permits went anywhere. So between 0 and 10 houses are built every year. And that is the end of my presentations. Thanks, Sophie.
Thank you, Cam. Wow, so many roadblocks for your community. Thank you for sharing that information with us.
Thank
Okay. So we heard from a representative from a smaller community. Now we will go to someone representing a large urban center. We have Nick Mead-Fox, Senior Engineer with the City of Vancouver. Hi, Nick. I saw
Hi,
you there.
everyone.
Hi. You need to share your webcam if you like.
Yes, just waiting for that to turn on
Okay,
here.
yes, it takes, there you go.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Thank you. And thank you for the introduction, Sophie. I'm Nick Mead-Fox. I'm a senior engineer specifically with the Green Infrastructure branch at the City of Vancouver. And I also want to mention that I organize a green infrastructure community of practice through the BC Water and Wastewater Association, where we discuss and promote green infrastructure in municipalities around the province. So if you're interested in anything that I bring up during this presentation, feel free to reach out and I can connect you to that group. It's a great place to learn more about this content. So first of all, I'm not a planner. I want to mention that I'm an engineer with a water resource background. I don't know a whole lot about Bill 44, but I am involved with a lot of planning initiatives in Vancouver. And our efforts to meet our expanding servicing needs using green infrastructure systems. So that's really what I want to share today. And even though we are a large municipality, I do think that a lot of the lessons and resources that I'm going to share here are relevant to municipalities of any size around the province. So what is green infrastructure? I'm sure many of you have heard of a whole bunch of different names for this stuff: green rainwater infrastructure, blue-green systems, nature-based solutions, or sustainable urban drainage systems. And it's all really the same thing with some variations in size and specific performance mechanisms. My preferred definition is just anything that uses vegetation, soils, and other engineered systems to mimic natural processes required to manage water and create resilient and healthier urban environments. So it can look like a whole bunch of different things, different sizes, different types of systems. We have green roofs, rainwater harvesting, large detention tanks, rain gardens and absorbent landscapes, permeable pavements, or rainwater tree trenches. All of these things are really aiming to just restore some of the features and services provided by a natural water cycle. And in a densifying area, these are really essential services like getting water out of our sewers, decreasing urban heat, creating stream flow, and creating a more enjoyable community for the public. And sometimes green infrastructure is viewed as kind of a panacea, and I've seen lots of slides like this that have all of these different benefits of GI. And the GI can offer all of these things. I think designing them to do all of these things at once is very difficult. So I think when planning out green infrastructure strategies, you should be a little more specific about what you want to do. From a servicing and densification perspective, the sort of key services and the main financial drivers for green infrastructure are decreasing water pollution and reducing urban flooding, seen here on the bottom right, enhancing resilience to climate change, and what's not explicitly listed here is this heat reduction aspect. So all of this stuff is about thinking strategically about adapting for the future. And that's really what green infrastructure can do, to sort of supplement our existing storm sewer systems so that we don't have to replace all of these storm sewers all at once. So it really is about responding to the climate emergency. And as Guy mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, Bill 44 does apparently have provisions to promote these actions. Green infrastructure does help with densification, servicing expansion, creates ecosystem health and service benefits. And really, it's this growth in aging sewer and drainage infrastructure component that is driving GI in the city of Vancouver. That in areas where, like, maybe we've installed the sewers recently, they do not need to be replaced, but we're already finding that they're undersized. That's where green infrastructure can come in to fill that gap. We're also expecting way more rain with climate change, more drought too, unfortunately. And we have found through a lot of our modeling efforts and monitoring of our systems that we can use green infrastructure to make up for this additional rainfall from climate change. In terms of heat reduction, this is also a huge driver of green infrastructure now. We had one of the largest mass fatality events in Canada in 2021, and we need more tree canopy and more green roofs to try to keep the city cool during these summer events. And of course, growth in utility servicing. I'm going to go fairly quickly through some of these slides to make sure I get to the more interesting content. So again, green infrastructure is great for water quality, for removing pollutants from streams. And in the city of Vancouver, we are very serious about all of this. We currently have about 332 green infrastructure assets, managing a decent amount of rainfall throughout the city. What you see here on the left is sort of our bread and butter system, bioretention or a bioswale, where you're just filtering water through plants and vegetation and then sending it to the storm sewer through an under drain or through a catch basin overflow. But we have much more ambitious targets here. We're hoping to manage 40% of our impervious area in the city using green infrastructure by 2050. And we're committed to this really rapid expansion. You can see here our expected drainage area capture projections. We're here at 2024, so we have a lot of work to do. But we are committed to this expansion because green infrastructure really does work. So from some of our modeling work, which we've confirmed through monitoring of our actual systems in the ground, we can infiltrate a little over half of annual volume that gets directed to these systems. And that big orange slice there is the catch basin inflow through those under drains that I mentioned. So that water is still cleaner than the water that would be if you were just sending it directly to the sewer system. It also slows down the flow into the sewer system. And when it comes to flooding and sewer backflow, that delay can be really important to distributing the flow and making sure our sewer systems have sufficient capacity. And then in terms of a design storm impact, which is really what our sewers are designed for, our modeling and the associated monitoring of these systems has shown that a well-designed green infrastructure system that takes up around 10% of the contributing catchment, which is pretty large, but it's also less than taking up the whole boulevard space. This can manage a 10-year, 1-hour projected increase for 2100 level rainfall patterns. So, this is just demonstrating that even for these really highly intense storms that we're expecting from climate change, green infrastructure can make up this difference so that our current pipes are still sufficient under these scenarios if they're supplemented with green infrastructure. So I'm going to talk about a quick case study here in the city of Vancouver. The Alberta Columbia Greenway, which you can find more information about on our website, is a large green infrastructure plan, which is sort of a perfect storm of an easy area to implement green infrastructure. So it's about 9 blocks of single-family residential homes. There's a large contributing drainage area. It's a pretty wide right-of-way, low traffic. There's adjacent park space. The sewers are under capacity, but they're not in need of replacement yet. And there's really high infiltration rates. So we can send water into the ground and towards the groundwater fairly successfully here. And we've integrated it with adjacent park space. We've managed to have some car-free blocks and one-way traffic. And this type of system is again meeting this need for some additional sewer capacity without needing to replace everything that we currently have in the ground. So it's not always that easy, unfortunately. This system was a pretty no-brainer solution to a pretty pressing problem. But there are some tips for everyone for planning for green infrastructure under harder circumstances. So I've tried to split up these recommendations into policy initiatives and technical resources. So for policy initiatives, the big ones are identifying your policy barriers to green infrastructure. A lot of these are things like foundation and utility setbacks, prohibitions against ponding and right-of-ways, or very small minimum boulevard widths. We found that anything less than a 2-meter boulevard, it's pretty hard to implement green infrastructure in those areas. It's also helpful to have some examples and templates for implementation expectations to show developers and city staff what we're looking for. And then allocating space, of course, within the rights of way, making sure that you have both surface and subsurface space allocated for that subsurface water storage component of green infrastructure. And then having standardized development and rezoning conditions for developments in higher density areas. And on the right, this is the more technical resources for engineering divisions, all of the standard engineering guidelines that you would have for any other infrastructure system, you need for green infrastructure too. But because it's new, most municipalities don't have these yet. However, the City of Vancouver does. We have pretty good sets of these resources for everyone. So please feel free to reach out if you'd like to discuss any of those. In terms of sort of determining feasibility, it's helpful to look at this from a bunch of different scales. So the first is sort of the citywide planning level. You do want to look for these areas where there's some clear sidewalk zones. Bike lanes can easily be incorporated with green infrastructure. You do need some front boulevard space and street trees. It's helpful to have a back boulevard too, so you can have more subsurface storage. And then, of course, just making sure that those areas are amenable to this additional space requirement. And then the other scale that I think is helpful to think about is the building typology scale. The City of Vancouver recently completed this large assessment of different building typologies and how green infrastructure can be incorporated into them. So we do have some sort of templates surrounding how we can fit all of these features in and meet our rainwater management requirements. And then, of course, in terms of development conditions, it's helpful to distinguish between development conditions for adding green infrastructure to the frontages of the lots on the right-of-way. And then it's helpful to also coordinate with your parks departments to figure out where you could use some of that park space for rainwater or stormwater storage. In terms of policy changes, these things are very impactful. So that pathway study that I mentioned before looked at all these different housing types and assessed the potential to meet our rainwater targets under the current policy conditions. So all these different scenarios are shown here. You see a lot of red because we couldn't really meet our policy requirements under the existing policy regime. But by modifying some of the setbacks to the foundations for infiltration and reducing the parkade requirements, a lot more of these scenarios become feasible. So in terms of major takeaways here that I want to make sure everyone takes from this presentation, the first is just that GI can help accommodate the densification that's going to be required. The infrastructure benefits for stormwater servicing and heat reduction are well proven, along with the community benefits, like just generally creating more green space, creating more walkability, and creating more habitat space, which most people in cities do appreciate as they get more and more dense. And expanding the right-of-ways wherever possible really helps make GI more feasible. So expanding right-of-ways reduces conflicts with other utilities, creates just physical space for green infrastructure. It creates space for wider root spread for street trees and helps with flood prevention. The key components there are creating wider boulevards and sidewalks, which can help address those utility conflicts, space, walkability, flooding. It is important to remember that our roads are also our major system floodways. Really, under large storm events, our sewers are not designed for those, and roadways do provide essential pathways for water to get away from properties. The next major takeaway is that formalizing development and rezoning conditions and providing a level of security, transparency, and consistency for developers is essential. It's really helpful to have these conditions that require developers to contribute to the road improvements and the on-site green infrastructure that we're going to need to accommodate the densification from the developments. And it's also important to provide support for developers and for engineering consulting firms with technical engineering standards and maintenance documents to make sure that we actually support the implementation of these things, and that it can be done reliably and effectively. More specifically, increasing property line setbacks to foundations and parkades creates more opportunities for private and public GI. Lot line development leaves no room for infiltration, and it doesn't always create the type of community that people want to live in. And finally, GI cannot go everywhere. I've spoken a lot about all the benefits here, but it is important to recognize that GI works where it is environmentally and technically feasible. If you have a really high groundwater level, no infiltration rates, and a mandate for sort of extreme lot line development, maybe it can go there, and you do need some sort of alternative compliance option for wherever it isn't. So that's it for my presentation today, and I'll pass it back to Sophie. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Stay on. Don't turn your camera off. I'm going to go to the Q&A section of our program. That was very informative, by the way. And I will ask all the other speakers to turn on their cameras and join us. We have about just over 20 minutes, so we'll keep to that. I'm going to randomly present the questions. I will name who I think might be best suited to answer. If you think you're not, just let me know. To the other people, please jump in at any time. And we'll begin. There you are. Hi, Carmi. Okay, so I am going to cut and paste the question in the chat window. And hopefully this works okay. Okay, so I think this is for either Paul or Carmi. Can building permits for SHMA developments be rejected based on inadequate servicing?
So my understanding is that.
Do you want to turn your camera on, Paul? There you go.
Yeah, sorry, I thought I had already turned it on. Didn't
No,
realize it wasn't
it's
on.
tricky. You have to click it twice.
So I actually think that's a bit of a legal question. It depends on what bylaws and circumstances a particular municipality or local government has. But my understanding is yes. But maybe Guy wants to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think that was kind of what I was trying to get at in my last slide that I probably burned through too quick. But yeah, it's not simply zoning compliance; it's compliance with all relevant bylaws and regulations. And Nick had mentioned that it's important to have these standards set out, the manuals, whatever, so all the developers know what they're up against. And that's the whole point of these Section 506 bylaws, where you put your standards in a bylaw. A developer can read the bylaw, the standards are attached, they know what the conditions will be, and they'll know that when they come to get a building permit, they're potentially going to have to require the works and services in accordance with the standards. And if those are the green infrastructure standards, then those are the standards that apply. And if they don't want to meet them, they'll have to get a variance.
Okay, thank you. So this question for Cam, what assumptions should be made for infrastructure provision in both infill and new greenfield areas, maximum build out of units, or an assumption of approximate build out?
Your new development, infill or greenfield, should meet the bylaw servicing requirements of the district.
Okay. Any others? Nope. Okay. We'll go to a question for Nick, and I feel like you may have already answered this one. How can we best achieve proper sidewalks, boulevards, and street trees and space for active transportation or transit in streets as we pre-zone for density?
I can touch a little bit more on that. So we have been in conversations recently about setting standard boulevard widths for commercial high street areas. And in those denser areas, we do want to make sure, or the standard we're operating under right now is 5.5 meters from property line to the roadway. That is often insufficient. It seems large, but you have about a 2 meter sidewalk, 1 meter back boulevard, and ideally a minimum 2 meter front boulevard to support those street trees in the right of way. No bike lane listed there, right? So some of the solutions we're dealing with are creating structural soil systems where you can have a load bearing soil underneath your bike lane which has lower loading requirements. And that load-bearing soil can still accommodate a lot of root growth from those street trees. So you're still providing the soil volume that street trees need, but you're putting it underneath the bike lane. And then, of course, just trying to expand those distances between the property line and your road curb, and maybe trying to create a standard that's a little bit wider.
Great, thank you. This one is for Paul or Carmi. The legislation does not appear to address improvement districts, i.e. community water supplier. How might improvement districts obtain the same funding opportunities to meet the anticipated growth? It may even be for Guy. Who would like to jump in there? Cam? No?
I should be able to answer that, but I can't. I'm sorry.
Okay. Paul, are you able to offer any ideas?
Well, I know Bill 44, I thought there was a threshold of community of 5,000 population or something like that for it to apply. So I would think like most improvement districts probably have populations below that, so it may not be applicable. And yeah, I think it's a little bit of a legal question, and I'm not able to answer it.
Right. Okay. No problem. We will go. I think this one is for Cam. For small communities, is there an expectation that densifying via SHMA will lead to more curb and gutter style streets, or could infrastructure still be built to more of a rural standard? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would think that with increased density, you probably want it to be more urban rather than less urban, because you're just increasing the services in a smaller place. But yeah, it's just I was thinking about that. The requirements there are built into our bylaw, so it wouldn't change depending on our bylaw.
Well,
I could just make a quick comment, which is that that's something that, in my view, the local government gets to decide whether or not density should lead to a different standard, or whether they're okay with having more density but sticking with the rural standard.
I'll add that there's some unexpected consequences we've found in areas that don't have curb and gutter roads where you're still connected to a storm sewer system. You get a lot of sediment accumulation from those grassy boulevards. And if you're sending all that water to a catch basin connected to the municipal sewer system, your sewers are going to get clogged eventually with all the sediment that goes into those areas. So if you're trying to justify the switch to curb and gutter, that's possibly a good thing to point to.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, to add to that, the curb and gutter protects the road, which would result because of more cars on the road because of the densification. So you want to protect the integrity of the road. So you would want it to be more curb and gutter.
One thing that we've found in town here, because Nanaimo was built up through the amalgamation of some improvement districts, and those were developed generally in the 60s and the 70s to a rural road standard. But now, with them being part of the city, densification is happening and stuff like that. We sort of see the consequences of not having like a more urban style cross section to the road, and probably one of the biggest things is that mode separation, that transportation mode separation between vehicles, cyclists, pedestrians. In a rural environment where there isn't a lot of density, there isn't a lot of traffic, the mode separation isn't as important for the pedestrians and the cyclists and so on. As you get more and more dense, more and more urban, there's that more conflict between those various modes, and so you need to have a space for them. And so that's the reason for that more urban cross section, is to have an allocated space for the pedestrians and for the cyclists and so on. And that's how you build that out within a given space. So I think you'll find if you don't do that, there's going to be all kinds of conflict.
Yeah, and to add one more, the time to put in the curb and gutter is when you're first developing the subdivision. After the subdivision is built, the curb and gutter is funded by the municipality rather than the developer.
Great. Such a robust discussion about curb and gutters. That's great. why don't we answer Corey's question here? Is SHMA applicable if there is no servicing and not in capital plan for the next 5 years, or do we have to react to legislation and create servicing extensions faster than may have otherwise? An additional question is, or do we have to react to legislation and create servicing capacity upgrades faster than may have otherwise? Anybody? Guy?
I could just mention that this, yes, it's applicable, except where that the exemption for land not connected to water and sewer that I mentioned, and you don't have to react to legislation necessarily by creating servicing extensions. So whether or not your Bill 44 or SSMUH obligations require you to change your zoning, you know, what I wanted to emphasize was that all they require you to do is change your zoning, right? Assuming you're caught by the Bill 44 obligations, all you do is change your zoning. Everything else gets decided separately, whether or not, right? So it's not an automatic obligation to then make a bunch of extra servicing decisions after the zoning is changed for you, if you will.
Okay, any other comments there? No? Okay, moving on. And this was directed to Nick. With the new legislation, are there any improvements to require retention of stormwater on site and at the surface, like rain gardens or swales?
Sorry, muted there. In the city of Vancouver, we do have requirements for stormwater retention. Our expectation in most areas is 24 millimeters. We've been trying to push to 48. And what that means is 24 or 48 millimeter rainfall capture from the area over 24 hours, which we've found in our area is equivalent to around 90% of the capture rates. And I'll add that getting compliance with those standards has been difficult. And that's why I think these green infrastructure standards to help developers actually get there are so essential. If you just set a performance standard without any sort of education or resources to meet it, that is not a viable or achievable expectation. So yes, those things are certainly important. They're really meaningful. They can do a great deal to supplement your sewer system, but you just have to do everything you can to make them achievable.
Okay. Next one is a little technical. Does underground wiring under subdivision servicing requirements allow for new development to provide 240-volt electrical service and wiring and trenching as part of off-site servicing? For example, the city could install curbside EV charging in the future. However, development only needs to deliver the underground wiring. Any comments on that one? I guess that would be a question for you, Nick.
I don't have too much detail on the specific voltage questions. I will say that our electrical conflicts have been easier to resolve than we expected with infiltration. So, you know, the systems are generally pretty resilient to having some water around them. All soil has water in it, and our electrical systems are designed for that. So I don't see any issue why that, or any reason why that couldn't be added to a development condition if the city wanted it in conjunction with a green infrastructure system.
So I can add a little bit to that if there's an interest. So the typically with developments, they the underground servicing requirements are for the private electrical services. So that's one thing. So the services to the private properties that develop through, as well as to the streetlights, which are typically a city-owned utility. So I think what the question is referring to is the potential for a public charging station or something like that potentially. Because if it's on the private side, that's something that the private side could decide to do based on the capacity of their service, whether it's a 200 amp service or a 400 amp service or what have you. Now the problem is that streetlights don't have a lot of load. They're a fairly low load application, whereas a car charger can be a fairly high load application. So it's quite a special service. If you want to consider something like that, you'd have to really think about it from the beginning and make sure that you've got the infrastructure in place to essentially put in a charger in the public sphere. So it is a fairly specific question, and I think just generally in a subdivision that hasn't considered it, it could be quite challenging to add that in.
Okay. Um, how do you ensure projects are serviced without rezoning?
Well, that was what I think that was what, like, that's like the main big question I was trying to deal with, is to say that you use all your other bylaws and authorities. You don't just rely on your zoning discretion. And so like Cam was describing, right, his experience with the subdivisions that where they say, well, you can't do it if you don't have the servicing. And Nick was describing how they have the standards, you know, entrenched, and where he described them as rezoning conditions, but I say you can do them as, you know, Section 506 bylaws. So yeah, I think you just have to use all the other authorities other than the zoning discretion that I say are available to you to achieve almost all of what we have been achieving traditionally at the zoning stage.
Mhm. Okay. Question by Joe. Suburban single-family neighborhoods are typically serviced by street-facing driveways. Shmoo could make these driveways very busy, creating conflict, particularly with pedestrians and cycling infrastructure. Can the approving officer require rear lane dedication? Is a front-ending agreement appropriate to enable laneway construction prior to permitting development? I guess that wouldn't that depend on your community?
I was going to try to find the approving officer section, but I might not be fast enough to do that unless you want to come back to it.
Sure, we'll come back
I
to
guess
that.
I can just add that, you know, the city of Vancouver is filled with laneways. We don't have as many front-facing driveways. They are great opportunities for green infrastructure. So if in your community you can make that switch, it does open up opportunities. It's also where a lot of our services are provided in the denser single-family residential areas.
But I would add, unless that you're able to connect to a like a road or something like that, the you know, if there is like road dedication created for a laneway in a backyard, it could be many, many decades before it has any access or use.
Absolutely.
Okay. Corey, we answered your question. We're just going to go on to another one, and then if we have time, we'll go back to that one. Does a regional district bylaw for a water or sewer utilities service have the ability to restrict additional connections for a secondary suite or ADU that is permitted by zoning? If yes, what should be considered or included when creating this restriction in the service bylaw? Could also be Guy, but I was thinking Cam could address the part, but what should be considered or included? All right. So either Cam or Guy.
Well, you
or
go
both.
first, Cam.
Yeah, absolutely. You can restrict the usage of a secondary suite if you can't service it. You just don't approve the building permit.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, especially if the bylaw says, you know, these are the conditions that you have to meet in order to get a connection, and the conditions can't be met, then the answer should be straightforward.
Okay. Any comments from Nanaimo? No? Okay. Does the recently announced federal infrastructure funding justify a reduction of DCCs for small lot infill density? Cam?
I think with increased density, the need to increase DECs is more important because you're using the water, you're producing more water, you're using more storm, you're using more wastewater treatment plants. So the usage of your facilities with pumping water to the house and away from the house is increasing. So the cost of your infrastructure usage is increasing. So the DCC should be increasing.
Makes sense. Are CACs still allowed, Guy? Or are they still in the mix?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think CACs basically rely on the zoning discretion that I talked about. So it's going to be hard, I think, to charge CACs for the mandatorily, you know, upzoned lands. And there's some new rules about density bonusing for TOA lands in Bill 16 that we won't get into. But to the extent that you have any residual zoning discretion, like if someone is asking for more than the minimum permitted or the minimum of mandatory densities, then yes, in my opinion, you might still be able to use your trustee CAC approach.
Okay. Another question, is Bill 16 meant to address the legislative gap to require road dedication and or sewer SRW, I'm not sure, something water, previously secured as conditions of zoning for areas that may now have been pre-zoned under SHMA?
Well, you have to ask the legislature, but I think the answer is probably yes.
Okay. I'll go on to one more question.
Let me give you one quick bit on this, on the lanes, because there is a section 75 sub 1E of the Land Title Act that says an approving officer can require compliance with all the following, including suitable lanes must be provided in continuation of existing lanes, and in every case where lanes are considered necessary by the approving officer. So that's just a little hook you might want to rely on for your lanes.
Did you all write that down? Everybody listening? This question, I don't know if it's very similar to the previous one. What changes are expected to address the lost opportunity to secure road dedication and SRW? What does SRW stand for, by the way, for planners that aren't engineering?
That's right away, I assume.
Oh, okay. At the time of rezoning, and or is this detail expected with Bill 16 and related regulations?
That'll be the same as the previous one, I think. I
Is
think
it the
that
same?
I think the legislature's response would be, here you go, read Bill 16. We've given you everything you could have asked for.
Okay. And then there's one general question for Nick. Any new requirements for infrastructure improvements and restoring local biodiversity? That's very general.
That's a pretty tough one. The city of Vancouver does not have anything on the books to explicitly promote that. And if you're looking for resources, the Surrey Biodiversity Design Guidelines are one of the best that I've seen out there for design that aims to achieve those ends. But that's a very hard thing to quantify. And if you can't quantify it, it's pretty tough to enforce it. So certainly an aim that any green space can provide, and the more diverse arrays of plants and habitat you can create, certainly you could have some association there, but there's no explicit targets in the city of Vancouver, at least.
Okay, I think I'm going to end it there. Thank you all very much. Guy Patterson with the law firm of Young Anderson, Paul Rosen and Carmi Simpson, both with the municipality or the city of Nanaimo, Cam So with the district of Lillooet, and Nick Mead-Fox with the city of Vancouver. And I just want to make a point of, we have not spelled Paul's name wrong. It is spelled P-O-U-L. Yeah. Okay. And I'm just going to go to our final slide here to remind the PIBC members to log on and record their, actually it should be 1.5 units that they've earned today. And for more information about this whole PLN topic, looking at it from different point of views, from legal point of views, from what we're doing now, the servicing, please go to our website. There's a lot of good information there. So thank you again, Cam, Paul, Carmi, Guy, and Nick for joining us. And we'll say bye to everybody.
Thanks, Sophie.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, Sophie.
Bye-bye.